offer, but I'm going to more focus on the premise of plant diversity, how it can help on our operations, reduce input costs, as well as manage drought situations. So quickly go through my story, some economics. I heard some talk this morning about input prices, so I'm going to cover it a little bit as well. Talk about our annual blends and our intercrops, our perennial blends, and then having the resilience to drought through soil health, and then give you guys some resources as well. So I farm with my wife and 2 daughters near Bonnyville, Alberta. We're a small cow-calf operation with some purebred seed stock that we deal with as well. We first generation farm, we started in 2018, very conventional. I come from Saskatchewan originally, spent 2 years at College of Agriculture and Animal Science. Have family that's very conventional farms, big grain farms, mixed cow-calf and grain farms, and it's all done very conventional. So in 2018, we bought our first 3 bred cows from a guy that was working for me at the time. He was looking to retire. In 2019, he decided to fully retire. We bought all of his equipment as a package. So we bought tractors and hay binds and balers and everything. And we really kind of got going because we wanted to start out on our own and grow our herd. 2019, we also added our daughter to the family, and I spent the summer out there on a 300-acre piece that we got at conventional hay ground that had been in the area for a while, and the landlord was a bit of a character, so nobody really wanted to rent from him, so we got the chance. In 2020 though, this is the field that I'm going to talk about a bunch. We took over a 31-acre field that was about a mile away from the house, and we got a lot of rain in 2020 in our area near Bonnyville. We got 23 bales dry hay, so we knew that this land wasn't super productive, and that we were going to have to do something with it over time. We just weren't sure what we were going to do. In 2020, we also bought one of our first purebred females. We did some embryo work with her. We sent her down to Cremona to the Sundown Livestock Transplant. We also started a farm to table operation. So we did about 1,000 broilers that year, about 50 hogs. We retailed some organic dairy products as well as our beef and our pork. And really, it was the first time in 2020 that we were the farm was able to actually kind of sustain itself. My oil field check wasn't going to support the farm exclusively. The farm is actually making its own money. My daughter at this point was a year old. My wife was trying to figure out what she wanted to do, whether or not she wanted to go back to work. We made the decision she was going to stay at home and be the farm operator, basically handle all the direct to farm sales. So it was a growing business, and we were doing really well. We started a website in March, just before COVID hit, so we timed everything just perfectly. And we thought we figured it out. We thought we were doing quite well. Well, then this happened. In 2021, drought hit all of us, right? And it knocked us down because you saw that little field that got 23 bales, obviously not enough to support a herd. I had still been buying in feed from the neighbors. Well, we got hit with drought, not as bad as everywhere else, but for our area, with what we're used to, it was a really bad. And all the hay that we had produced went south. So there was nothing to be found. So we looked at our different feed options. We brought in straw from the Hutterites, we brought in molasses, we brought in pellets and screeners. We ended up doing everything we could. We bought a bale buster to fence line feed. Everybody helped out. We carried pails and pellets all winter long. And honestly, it was, as everybody in this room knows, 2021 was a really bad year. It was the hardest year on our farm, but I wouldn't change it for anything because it put into motion a lot of thought process changes in ourselves that set us up for where we are now. So we ended up actually buying, at the end of the year, we bought a Super B load of hay at I think $260 a bale. It came into Yorkton, Saskatchewan. We had to take a loan out that we're still paying off for one month's worth of hay basically. And I said to my wife, when we were coming into 2022 at this point, and I said to my wife, I said, we got to do something different. Like we can't continue on. We obviously know in a good year, our land is only producing 30 bales of hay at the most, 25 that first year. We got to look at other things. So I got into Facebook and I got onto YouTube and I started doing some research into other feed options. And one thing that came up was sorghum sudan grass. So sorghum sudan grass, for those of you that don't know, is the corn family, grows really tall. All the videos you see on YouTube of it, guys are getting 10, 15 bales an acre, just bumper crops. Well, it doesn't quite work here. And I got on Facebook and asked about it and tried to source some seed, and I got told I've seen pictures from everything from 6 inches in a full growing season to 6 feet. And I said, I also can't risk that. So I was looking for other options. And at the time, a friend and colleague in the Speckle Park breed reached out and said, hey, there's this new company in Manitoba just fired up. They're doing blends with sorghum that you can look at. They're not full sorghum, but maybe it's something that'll work. And so I jumped on Cover's website as a customer and as a grower, and I started looking at the resources they had in terms of webinars and educational stuff, and it sent me down a path of soil health that I'm going to kind of share with you guys a little bit today, and really changed how we farm and how our operation manages things. So in the fall of 2021, we were actually the first farm in Alberta to buy our seed. We booked our seed, I think, in about September. So this is our daughters out picking rocks. So that 30 acres, a neighbor came, dished it up for us. We sprayed it out, we dished it up. This is us getting ready to seed, and on July 20th, that's what the crop looked like. I added no additional fertilizer. I went based on exactly what they had told us to do, and actually this year we had some drill failure because we had broken it up and came in with a hoe drill and not knowing what we were doing. We seeded a bunch too deep, so we lost a bunch of species. But basically, by the end of the growing season, I still put up 74 silage bales on August 24th with no additional fertility into that soil. So, what's that, sorry?
30 acres?
Yeah, I think 31 acres with the Douglas taken out, yeah. So I put up 74 bales. They were 2,500 pounds. They were big, about 55% moisture. And it kind of really sparked, okay, there's something to this. It might not be the be all end all, but there's definitely something to this, and it requires further investigation. So I started going down the path even further. So of course I planted the same stuff in 2023, bought a better drill, invested a little bit more money. We did nothing to the land. I didn't spray it. I didn't fertilize it. I just seeded directly into it. I think I harrowed it just to spread out the manure from the regrowth the cows had grazed. And then in 2023, in July, I took out 95 cents. And the interesting part, and we'll get into it too, is the precipitation differences don't line up with the yield differences. So it matched what I'd been learning and what I thought was true about soil health and about plant diversity. And I was seeing it on our own farm. Now, you can see the regrowth from there when you're taking those bales off, it's coming back nicely, and you got lots of moisture this year. Plan was originally to graze it, but I had since actually been approached by the company to switch careers and switch paths in my life, and I joined the covers team as a sales rep. So rather than risk being on the road and freezing and having to haul water, we decided to harvest the regrowth, and we took an additional 18 bales off of that in September. So in total, I got 113 bales, silage bales off 30 acres with one pass of glyphosate in 2 years, one pass with the disc, and absolutely no fertility. So my input costs are very, very low for what I'm getting back, and the feed quality is very, very high. So we get to play with some nice, well, anybody with a technical use agreement, if you're growing canola or anything like that, has access to this. But these maps, the colored maps, are from, I believe it's Bayer, has a program called Climate Field View. It's available online. It's free for what we use it. They make their money using implementation and tractors and combines and stuff for yield monitoring. But it basically is a biomass monitor where I can compare rainfall data to the amount of biomass. So I'll just go through it here. 2020, you can see it's a little brown, but we got some green in there. It's a little lighter color. That's the year that we got the 23 bales. 2021, we didn't take a crop off of it because there was nothing there. We grazed it for a couple weeks and that was it. And you can see the moisture, obviously, we were quite dry in our area for there. But where it gets interesting as we look into 2022, again, we've added no fertility. In 2023, it just keeps kind of getting better and better. Even though the rainfall, we get a little bit more rain this year, but then we're down during the growing season in 2023. So there's something happening there, and it really made me kind of question it, especially when you compare what 21 and 23 looked like on the same ground. Being able to have that kind of yield without additional inputs was really interesting to me, and I know it's been interesting to a lot of our customers and to other producers. So again, this kind of comes into the interesting part. Based on the growing season, we had the same amount of moisture in 2021 as we did in 2023 this year, based on the rainfall data. And yet we were able to capture and have a fairly significant harvest of that field by the same date. So it really got me thinking what's going on. And the truth is, it's the microbiology and it's the soil health that's playing the biggest part in this. And we really need to focus as producers as to the dirt that's growing our plants and not the plants that it's growing. And we're realizing that as an industry. I know I heard you guys talking in the corner earlier about.
But hey, I'm not lying. You went over to the Red Deer show
100%.
and walked in and said, soil health, they were told to leave that building, sir.
100%. I remember talking and hearing guys and like,
Yes.
I'll talk about a little bit about him, but Gabe Brown is the godfather of the regenerative soil health movement. Joe, one of our founders, and he's the type that when he comes to a room, you gotta be in a rink or something like that, because so many people know his name and want to come out. Joe sat in a room where there was two other guys other than Joe and his dad for a Gabe Brown talk about 10 years ago.
You know Steve Kenyon?
I do, yeah.
Steve Kenyon's another guy we get a lot of information from too.
Yeah.
We actually went to a course where he actually dug down and looked at soil health.
Yeah, we did, actually on our, on our YouTube channel, Steve came out, and Steve and I were quite closely together, and he came out and did a talk for us at a Camera Soil Health Day.
Yeah.
And he talked about digging down and finding organic matter, not being able to see the difference in a field that he's intensively managed. And it's incredible for what we can get, and the cost of it really is just, it's effort and planning is the biggest thing. So talk about cost of production and what we're making in this industry. Has anybody seen this graph before in any of your travels? So this is by Darren Coleman. He's Stats Canada employee. This is basically Canadian net farm income from 1926 to 2016. Anybody know what the blue line is? Take a guess.
Agribusiness.
No, that's what we're making. That's how much we as an industry are producing. We're the best we've ever been. We're producing more than we ever have in the past. What's the green line at the bottom here? That's how much we're putting in our jeans. We as an industry are doing better now than we ever have before in terms of producing. We hear nothing in the cattle industry, our cow herd's down, our national cow herd's down, but if you look at the economics of what our gross carcass weights are and how much actual beef in the grocery store we're producing, it stayed virtually the same. It's dipped a bit, but not in relation to how much our numbers are down in the last 10 years. We are doing a better job of producing more as an industry than we ever have, and we're doing worse than we ever have of making money while we're doing it. Because as a first generation farmer coming into this industry, something like that does not excite me. It makes me seriously question passions and hobbies here at this point. Like I should probably take up something. And the reason for that though, and I want to point this out, where these numbers, you see, this is where we start really getting the divergence of the lines. You know, anybody know what happened in around that time?
Introduce the middleman, probably.
War.
End of the Second World War. Majority of the agricultural synthetic inputs that we're using on our operations day to day were originally developed during the war effort for munitions, sprays, anything like that related to war effort. So all of those research dollars, all of that money that was being spent during the war effort, when the war ended, that train was already in motion and they needed to find another outlet for these products. And conventional agriculture was the ticket. If you look back on the fundamental ingredients for a majority of the herbicides and the pesticides that we're using started during the war effort as bomb material and herbicide.
Yeah, 240.
Yeah.
Still being used.
So we basically reverted that to agriculture because we found a benefit to it and we did a good job with it. But I get to thankfully now talk to producers of all generations, and I talk to some of the older producers and they say, well, when synthetic fertilizer came out, we got a huge increase on 10 pounds an acre. You're not getting a huge increase on 10 pounds an acre anymore. So for every year that we use this stuff and every year that we put this money onto our operations, we have to use more the next year in order to get the same result. And it's a cycle that we're not going to come off of unless we really start changing things. And we had a attendee yesterday that asked a question regarding, well, you know, can we just stop? And the answer is no. And Gabe has a pretty good line in some of his talks is our soils are drug addicts. You take a drug addict and you strip them of all, they go into major withdrawal and have some major health issues. If you were to take a big operation and just stop everything, you're going to have a wreck. So we have to look at ways of doing incremental changes and making practices adjust to what we want to accomplish over the course of time. So I love this quote from John F. Kennedy: "The farmer is the only man in our economy, buys everything at retail, sells everything in wholesale, and pays the freight both ways."
It's true.
Like I love seeing that shrink in that transport fee on my calf check every year. Like it just makes me happy. So I'll ask this question: what is 96% of every plant made of? What's that?
Water.
Water, okay. What else? Nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur. Carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. Sunlight and water. That's 96% of what our plants are made up of. Now, what's the difference between the 4% here and the 96% up there? The 4% is $1 billion fertilizer industry that we focus on exclusively. Like, I didn't finish because I had the allure of big oil patch money, and I frankly didn't like studying that much, but I remember enough about College of Agriculture, and we talked about nitrogen, we talked about soils, and we talked about phosphorus, and we talked about all that stuff. We never once talked about how can we better capture sunlight? How can we better hold water within our soils? Even though 96% of a plant's growth is related to those elements. That's what we need to focus on, is capturing more sunlight and holding more water. So we're going to talk mostly about plant diversity and living root today, but I don't want to do a talk like this without bringing up all 5. But these are really the 5 principles of soil health. If you can take anything away from my talk today, take these away, go home, do some research, and figure out how you can implement these individual practices on your farm. But it's plant diversity, having a diverse structure of plants, soil armor, protecting that soil from sunlight, wind, and water and erosion, minimizing your disturbance, both chemical and physical, animal integration. We have to get animals back onto our landscapes and onto our land, and living root as long in the growing season as possible. So I talked a little bit about my aha moment. This is why the company is formed. So this was Joe Gardner Farms, that's one of our founders, and Travis Avery, another one of our founders. Travis was working for Taurus Ag and A&L Soil Labs at this point. Joe had just got out of college and was just trying to farm. He'd just gone to a Gabe Brown talk and learned about plant diversity and cover crops. And basically they took this soil test, came up about 6 parts per million phos and a soil pH of 7.8. And Joe said, well, I'm going to throw 15 species at it. And Travis says, nothing's going to grow. You're going to have issues. You're going to have deficiencies. You're going to have things that go wrong. Well, he sowed it at 3/4 of an inch. He made sure he had good seed to soil contact and he had even emergence. Now, this looks like a bit of a weedy mess to a lot of people. I look at that now, looking at it as a beautiful thing where we've got different plant architectures all emerging at the same time, different plant types, different plant species that I know are going to work together with the right conditions. So 28 days after seeding, there's absolutely no sign of any nutrient deficiencies on 6 parts per million in phos, and the plants in the soils are starting to reach a symbiosis where they can work together in order to produce a significant amount of biomass. And when things get rocking on these diverse cover crops, it really happens. So this is the difference of 4 days with the quad and the rough with the same spot, and you can see the growth. And I talk to growers that are experimenting with the first time, and I say, really, 45 days, have faith, even don't look at it. At day 45, go and look at it every day until you harvest it. Because they say with corn in a good year, you can hear it growing, and truly with this stuff, you can damn near hear it growing because it grows so fast in such a short amount of time at the end of its cycle that everything comes together. It's just amazing to witness. And this was their first attempt at a full season, and this was their aha moment that, you know, we're on to something, and we're not on to something that we invented by any stretch of the imagination. We've been toying with this for a few hundred years in conventional agriculture, and Mother Nature's been perfecting this system for millions of years. We're just rediscovering it and using it to our advantage. So this was a study that was done by General Mills about 5 or 6 years ago, I think it was now. Basically, they looked at total nutrient extraction 0 to 12 in the soil profile for the following minerals. What would you expect to see on a test for, and I'm talking unavailable phosphorus in your soil. We'll just talk phos. So we all know the available and the unavailable. What do you think on a pound per acre basis is in our soils for phosphorus? Anybody?
There's nothing here. We gotta put it every year.
Gotta put it exactly, right?
Every year.
Every year you gotta put it.
Yep.
Why is that?
Because the soil's deficient in it. It's locked up and tied up.
It's locked up. So 2,300 pounds they found of phosphorus in these 49 farms on average were locked up in the soil. And right, we have to put on phosphorus every year. Phosphorus and calcium binds to create calcium phosphate, holds on, does not let that phosphorus release into the soil and be available to plants. But yet you go to any forested area, any ditch line, anywhere where we're not disturbing soils, and those plants are growing even in drought years. Like I know the one consistent with drought in our area at least is the crops might not grow, but damn, those MD mowers still have to run
Yeah, that's right.
every year, right? And it's because we haven't disturbed those soils, we haven't added anything to those soils, and we've got a diversity of plant species in those soils. So if we're averaging, like on Joe's farm, 12 pounds an acre on a soil test of available phosphorus, but we've got 2,300 pounds of unavailable phosphorus. We've got all the nutrients we ever need. We just have to figure out how to access those. And it's not that it's hard, it's just that it takes a bit of a mindset change. And really the truth of the matter is it's microbiology, as we talked about, to access those soil nutrients. So this is 2 examples. We're going to talk, this is our diverse polycrop on the right-hand side. This is a beautiful even emergence canola crop on the left-hand side. There's 3 main things that we have to get into symbiosis. A diversity of plant species, create a diversity of root exudates, and create a diversity of soil microbes. Now, what is a root exudate? That's the key binder between those 2. A root exudate is basically a simple sugar, for the simplest terms, that plants release into the ground through their root system that feed microbiology, which create population growth within the microbiology system, that then they can go out and break down and break those chemical bonds in the soils. So for 45% of every ounce of energy that a plant takes from the sun through photosynthesis, 45% of that carbon is expelled out the root systems as root exudates to feed the microbiology in the soil. And that's key, because if we have one species like this, it's doing the exact same thing. It is creating root exudate, it is feeding that microbiology. But where the kicker is it's feeding one type or a limited number of types. And the other thing is what happens in this stage when this all goes to flowering. The plant says its number 1 goal is to reproduce and to go to seed. It's now at that point, it stops producing root exudates and feeding the soils, because now it's converting all of that energy from sunlight into seed production so that it can populate the next generation, as all life intends to do. So it stops feeding the soil. Microbes are still there though, we just fed them for 2 months. What are our microbes going to eat in our soils if we're not feeding it through root exudates anymore? Well, how do we refer to carbon in our soils? Organic matter. So that's why we wonder, well, we can drop straw and we can do all the practices that we think can minimize tillage, but we're still growing monocrops year on year on year on the same ground, and we wonder why our organic matters. Because at the end of it, when those plants go to maturity, we've stopped feeding this whole soil profile. And the only thing that they have to eat at that point, the microbes have to eat at that point, is the organic matter that's present in our soils. Now compare that to a polycrop like this, where obviously we have a whole bunch of different root structures. We're able to get to different areas in the soil profile. This, for instance, this sunflower is going to maturity now, it's stopping the root exudates, but this turnip isn't, and the legumes next to it aren't. So we're constantly feeding that soil throughout the growing season. And this is what it looks like in actuality. We've got multiple different plant architectures. We've got tall plants. We've got indeterminate legumes that don't go to seed, that stay vegetative. We've got creeping vining plants that access sunlight. So we've got our tall sunflowers that grow here. But if there's a piece of soil or a piece of sunlight hitting soil over there, we've got a vine that will go over and pick up that sunlight before my computer dies and lose everything. So we're maximizing our soil capture. And in this picture, you can see we've got absolutely no visible soil. So we're doing a couple things with just the coverage alone in the canopy. We're preventing soil dry out from heat. There's studies that have shown like 25-degree differences between soil temperatures on canopied soil and non-canopied soil. So we're preventing evaporation, we're holding water better that way. And we're feeding that soil in a way that we can maximize the amount of microbiology in there, break those chemical bonds of those unavailable nutrients. We get asked lots by first-time growers where they do a soil test in the spring, they produce a really big crop and they're very happy with it. They call us and they say, man, it produced, it did 5 tons an acre, whatever it might be, that first year with no fertilizer. But I did my soil test and I saw no change. And my answer always is exactly. Because you had nutrients in your soils, You've now just grown a huge crop and your nutrients are still in your soils. So how did that happen? And it just is a light bulb to them where it's like, okay, we've accessed stuff that we didn't show up on the soil test. The phosphorus we needed came from unavailable phosphorus. We broke those chemical bonds. That's why our soil tests look the same. But what we have done is we've boosted, if we do an organic or like a Haney soil test or a microbiology soil test, we've boosted those microbial populations and we've started healing that soil. So I'm gonna just kind of blast over our blends a little bit because I want to get into more about the water holding capacity and stuff. But basically how we approach this is on our annual blends, we've got 3 annual blends: cool season, full season, and warm season. And I forgot to mention too at the beginning, if anyone has any questions, feel free to interrupt. Like I'd love to have a conversation and chat. Some of the best information comes from that. So basically our full season, we're at about 16 species, 13, I think, in our full and 12 or so in our warm and 12 in our cool. And basically what we're doing is just mixing 3 different plant types by 2 different plant species to give us really 6 different plants. And what we're trying to do is maximize these growth curves throughout the growing season. So we always get asked, why so much diversity? Why different plant species? All that stuff. And the reason is this right here, because when we plant in the spring, for instance, if we're going to plant early spring, May 1st, we know our soil temperatures are going to be low, but our cool season species are going to do really, really well in those situations. Our barley, our oats, our peas, right? We know that they do well in our growing situation. But when we get those 30-degree or 34-degree god-awfully dry July days, we get nothing for growth, right? That's why we've added the warm season species, so that during that time, we're still going to be photosynthesizing, we're still going to be growing, we're still going to be feeding that soil. And that's why we have a mixture of all those plant species. So uses on the farm, there's a bunch of them. Dry hay, lots of guys put it up as dry hay. Silage, nice thing with any full season, any diverse cover crop is you're not limited to one maturity date like we talked about. You're gonna have vast different maturity dates, which means your moisture contents are gonna stay high. So we've got a really wide silage window. Example of this is July 29th at Surrey's Colony. You can see in the shadow, like very little light's hitting that bottom of the canopy, and you've got all the different warm season species that are coming up. So we're gonna cut this early, we're gonna get more regrowth. We're gonna have a little more protein, a little bit less energy. But compare that to Darlingford, which is just up the way. Same thing, this was 23 days later, but we had the same amount of moisture. And any of you guys that are putting up silage know that's one of the troubles with putting up silage in a monocrop situation is that you got a tight little window for maintaining not only quality but moisture in order to have a proper ensiling process. Whereas with this, your feed test will change slightly, but your ensiling process is gonna stay the same and be able to properly ferment and do what you need to do. We have lots of producers that are grazing cover crops. Personally, one of my favorite ways of doing it, because the animal integration factor is there, we're putting so much back under the soil. We're not taking, it's so much cheaper to move the cows to the feed than it is to feed to the cows. So rotational, we have regrowth grazing as well as standing grazing. So this is our field this year. This is what we took. We got 18 bales off this. This is the regrowth in September, after we'd already taken the harvest off in July. So we were fortunate to get some August rains, but it will come back, and those, because if you take it early enough and those plants are still vegetative, they still have that goal of hitting reproduction. So they're going to try to regrow it. This is an example of some dryland regrowth. 3-way mix, barley, oats, and peas, and our full season harvested the exact same day, same amount of moisture, same field, same nutrient requirements. And you can just see the different species are going to flourish depending on the year. If you have a really, really wet, cold fall, you're going to have more regrowth in your cool season species. If you're a hot, dry fall, your warm season, they're going to come up. And it gives us that insurance policy too, that where something is going to grow. I use my land as an example all the time. We have turnips and radishes in our blends. For some reason, my dirt just does not grow turnips and radishes. Nowhere in my field do I find turnips and radishes. So if I had planted a field of turnips and radishes, I would have gone broke. But I didn't. I planted a mixed crop, so it didn't matter. I didn't have turnips and radishes. I had more of something else. Go 2 miles down the road to my neighbor, and his looks like a vegetable garden, and the turnips and radishes are huge. And he gets a really good response from that, but there's a couple things that don't do well in his soils. And our yields are virtually the same, even though there's distinctive species difference in our crops. So again, with grazing, rotational regrowth and standing, this is an example, just some standing grazing, basically letting it go to full, just about full maturity and kicking the cows out. This is probably, depending on what your goals are, if you're going for soil health, this is probably the best way to do it. Because you're gonna be able to, as Steve says, you know, take 50, leave 50, or whatever his metric is that he uses. Right? You're gonna be able to play it, but you're gonna have more, and I use air quotes, waste. I don't look at it as waste, I look at it as litter, I look at it as nutrients for the following year. But just like corn grazing or anything like that, where you're grazing standing, they are gonna trample more into the ground. So if your goal is strictly feed days, you may wanna look at doing some mob grazing or rotational grazing on that in order to control it a little bit better. Swath grazing is becoming hugely popular. Our approach to swath grazing through a soil health and a cover crop perspective is using plant species that are gonna weather in the swath and maintain quality. So our warm season species like our German millet, sorghum, and our mung beans naturally have a waxy leaf surface that they've developed over time to prevent evaporation out of the leaf to hold that moisture in, because they're warm, they're African plants, they're warm season plants, so they have to prevent evaporation. What's that, sorry?
German millet is got a waxy.
Yep. So it's got that waxy leaf, so what ends up happening is we see in this picture.
So in other words, you're saying that swaths they don't discolor, they stay green then?
This is in January, and it's a little bit hard to tell in the picture because it's got a filter on it, but it's very green inside. And it reduces waste, and we have a lot less spoilage compared to like an oak or a barley green feed swath graze, situation. And then we get asked about the sorghum and their warm season. So it's low lignin and it's highly digestible. The cows absolutely love it. They clean it up really, really well. It's not chopped, it's just laid out there. But even something like that, one thing we get asked about, well, okay, now what do I do to deal with it? Do I seed into it? Do I have to harrow it? Well, I like to minimize disturbance, so if I can avoid putting anything into the ground, I will. So I'm gonna seed right into it with my no-till drill. But the other thing too is we've now just spent 8 months feeding the microbiology in our soil. It's amazing how fast that breaks down in the spring. It's amazing how fast. So if you look at this, is the same field. These pictures are taken in the wintertime, and you can see what's left, and there's very little left there. Because that soil microbial activity has just consumed that carbon off the top of the surface. No different than if you've ever had a garden that you've added manure and compost to year on year, and then you try to mulch method and you've thrown a bunch of straw on it. I know I went away from work a couple of years ago, and my wife had me put a bale of straw in the garden. Came back about a week and a half or 2 weeks later, and I'm like, where'd all the straw go? There was very little left, like it just had disappeared. It had worked into the soil on its own, and the microbes had eaten it, but that was years of compost, so our microbial level was really high. And this is like, we just go straight into it there with a disc drill. Now, if you're in a hoe drill situation or a tillage drill, Joe does a bunch on some of his bigger land, he just goes opposite direction. Rather than going with the swaths, he goes and cuts across them, and he says he has very little issues of compaction or plugging or anything like that. So the big question and the big spend that we have on our farms is fertilizer. So the answer is, does fertilizer help? Sometimes. This is an example of a dry land situation, fertilizer on the left, no fertilizer on the right. I always explain this slide as, I need water, I need food, I need shelter. Microbes need water, they need food, they need shelter. If we're in a very, very dry year, our microbial populations don't have the moisture that's needed in order to replicate in the soils. Thus, we need them to replicate in order to break those chemical bonds with the unavailable nutrients in our soils. So in very dry conditions, some fertilizer will assist because we simply don't have the microbial populations that are desired. So in this though, this is the situation where if this gets rain, which in this year it didn't, but if this had gotten rain, it's amazing how fast these will equal out, even adding fertilizer. And we can see that a little bit here where this is already starting to get a little bit of rain, but this little strip right here had fertilizer added to it. You can see a little bit of difference now. It was full rate fertilizer. About a week and a half, 2 weeks after this field day, they got rain and they couldn't tell where that fertilizer strip was in the field anymore. And we had that backed up by some research we did with small plot ink. So by flowering time in the trial, little to no difference between the treatment and the no fertilizer treatment was statistically the same as our fertilizer. So it's all depending on moisture, and it's depending on, situations of, obviously we're not fortune tellers, we can't tell what's going to happen in that year, we can't tell if it's going to rain. But if it does rain, the unfortunate part about it is if you add fertilizer, basically looking at no net return on that fertilizer, that water would have.
No, you gotta build at the end, remember?
That's what I mean, right? And I always say too, well, this is what we recommend, but I always say in that, every input that you're putting onto your farm, there should be a test strip in every single field. And if we're not doing that as producers, we're only hurting ourselves. Because and I don't care if it's bugs in a jug, microbial, mycorrhizal, fertilizer, foliar, I don't care what it is. If we don't have some sort of comparison within our fields, we have no way to know if that's if we're gaining from that money that we're spending. And you as producers and me as a producer, I want to know if I'm going out spending $40 an acre, I better see a $40 an acre return on that investment at minimum, or I'm not going to spend the money. So if I take a strip off of a headland and leave that strip and it looks the same in the fall, did I get my $40? And I say that for absolutely everything. So for us, we found even in dry years, the maximum amount where we see a return is 40 pounds an acre of nitrogen and 10 pounds an acre of phos. Anything over that in all of our tests just hasn't netted an increase in yield compared to the cost. So if you're going to fertilize, if you're going with any of our cover crop blends, if you're going to fertilize, keep them below 40 and 10. And then most of our blends are sown without any synthetic fertilizer, including all the pictures in this presentation, just except for the fertilizer one, of course. Now herbicide. There's obviously no in-crop spray for 16 species mix. We're gonna nuke something if we spray it. So pre-burn and seed prep is where we take care of our weeds. I'm not a fan of glyphosate. I don't like that I have to use it, but I do. I try to stick to an every 2-year program. So this will be my herbicide year where I'm going to burn off my field. Last year I did nothing to it and got a yield increase. But I've already noticed this year the field's looking kind of green already coming back, so I'm gonna burn it off this year. But doing some work pre-seeding or pre-emergence is gonna really benefit you in the end. These aren't magic beans. And when I'm referring to this, I'm not just talking about our blends, I'm talking about all our competitors' blends, or if you make blends at home. Just because you put seeds together doesn't make them magical. So they're still gonna be under the same weed pressure, same pressures that other crops are. If you would look at a weedy mess field and say, well, I'm definitely not going to seed canola into that, don't seed this into it. Deal with that problem first, and whether or not it's tillage or it's burn off, trying to minimize your disturbance will also minimize your seed disturbance for your weed seed bank. So if you can go in with less disturbance, you're going to end up with less weeds in the crop as well. If you do have problems with weeds, just cut it early. My cows will eat weeds just the same as they'll eat grass in a bale. So for me, I'll cut a little bit early if I have to, if I notice I've got a bit of a weed problem, I'll capture those weeds, immature weeds in a bale, rather than letting them go to maturity and heading out. And we all know weeds mature a lot faster than what the plants we're trying to grow. So cut it early. You're gonna basically lose a little bit on the front end, but you're gonna make up with it on the back end because you're gonna get that extra regrowth anyways, because you're giving all those plant species more time. So some of the stuff we have for 2024, forward soybeans we introduced this year, wildly popular, pretty much sold out. But basically it was an intercrop soybean. If you're doing any corn silage, goes in the rows of corn silage and basically add nitrogen to your corn. Our fall forage, which we're going to talk about, and then we talked a little bit about our swath grazing. We also have we had 3 perennial blends. We sold out of salinity as well. But basically we have a light land and a heavy land perennial blend. And we'll talk about those bits. So basically the main difference is we've got, this is our light land. It's a little bit higher seed rate. We're working under the same premise that our annual blends are, diversity. So we've got 3 different types of alfalfa. All are going to do well in certain situations depending on the year. We're working with Interlake Forage Seeds out of Manitoba. They've been in the perennial seed supply and procurement business for 25 years. They're the ones that helped build us this blend. The bird's foot trefoil is one we're excited about at 5%. It's a low bloat legume that's going to help feed those soils with giving still the grazing ability with reducing the level of bloat risk. And then we've got this one here that also has the red clover in it at 7.5%, again, to feed those heavier soils. We've had a lot of producers this year actually even taking one step further in underseeding with a multi-species. So whether or not it's one of our blends or someone else's blend that they're making it themselves, but they're underseeding it with 15 species and basically putting 30 species in the ground and really getting a huge boost that first year and getting a fairly significant yield. So, but this is one that's been really interesting to me the last couple of years that I'm trying to figure out how to implement on our own operation, but it's fall forage because we're trying to maximize the 96%. If we can maximize the amount of sunlight we're capturing, the amount of root exodus we're feeding our microbiology throughout the year, we've got 2 major seasons that we do nothing with. We don't do anything in spring, we don't do anything in fall. Our land is basically barren at that point. So if we can figure out how to get something growing and keep growing and be productive for us as producers during those seasons, we always get asked the added, well, it's going to consume water, and the little bit of water that I have in my soil, it's going to get. I don't agree. I simply don't agree because I've seen the difference. And when we have microbiology in our soils and we're able to penetrate those, we're able to hold more water, as we're going to talk a little bit about the drought resilience. So having living plants fosters growing more living plants. Having dead, barren soil isn't helping anybody. So the idea behind their double cropping system would be, we had a conventional cash crop, let's say an oat or barley, we're gonna harvest it here, and we're gonna seed directly behind it, just like in this picture, where we've got the seeder right behind the combine. We're gonna seed a fall forage right into it. So it's gonna establish in the fall, it's gonna come up a little bit, depending on when you get it in. It's some producers that will actually kick cows out, graze it lightly once, just to knock it down, because with winter seeded plants or fall seeded plants, there is a bit of a balance between too big and you can risk winter kill, too small, you can risk winter kill, you kind of want to be right in the middle. So we'll kind of give it a once over if it's getting a little too big. From there, that's where we're planting. From there, it's going to come and continue to grow into the spring. So in a year like this year at home, we're really dry. We just got our first inch of rain this week. We haven't had any rain yet in the spring. My pastures were looking pretty barren. This is what we could have kicked out onto. And I went and visited a couple guys that had grown similar winter mixes and stuff like that, and driving past their places, their neighbors' hayfields are still barren and brown, and the fall forage is already coming up and it's nice and green. But gives you that early start to the season to be able to kick cows out onto pasture early, or if you want, harvest it kind of in around here. So then you're going to take it for a storage forage, put it up in bale, put it up in silage, do whatever you can or want with it, and give you the ability to then plant some warm season plants right in around here at the beginning of summer when the growth season for warm season plants are at their peak. And we talked about it, the C4 plants, German melon and sorghum stands, they've got the waxy leaf, but they have no tolerance to frost. They're next to zero frost tolerance. So if we plant them too early, which works out in a fall forward situation, because we're going to want to let that grow up into beginning mid-June, we're going to be nice and warm, we're not going to have any risk. And then basically we can harvest that here as it comes down on its growth for swath grazing, baled in the fall, whichever we want to do with our operation that works. And the nice thing is, again, we still have the growth curve, we still have some cool season species in that blend, so we're still going to get some of that fall regrowth into the next spring, which then we can terminate and go into with a cash crop or go back into with something else. But it keeps that living root in that soil on both of our shoulder seasons, really feeding the soils. And that's the warm season as it's coming up. So we talked a little bit about implementation, and I strongly suggest you don't look at this as a wholesale, well, I have to do it all or I can't do any. Incremental small changes of those 5 principles of soil health will always net you benefits. So if you can plant it, if you pick, say your 5,000 acre farm, you plant 35 acres, you can see it, it's a small scale, move that 30 acres around. So we always say, use it as a tool. So I have neighbors now that they're about year 5 growing multi-species, and basically in a canola crop situation, and I haven't talked about it, but mycorrhizal fungi, if that name sounds familiar to anybody, one of the oldest living organisms, permeates, well, it used to permeate through every inch of our soils across the world. Now with conventional agriculture and growing brassicas such as mustard and canola, we've lost a lot of that because our canola doesn't form a relationship with mycorrhizal fungi. We have a very mycorrhizal dependent and fostering blend with our full season and our warm season. So the nice thing is that we can build the populations this year on our full season. And then the next year, when we go back into it with the cash crop, our biology is there to really help that cash crop survive. Not to mention that we've also done a lot of work to the soil and water holding that we'll talk about. So using it as a tool, it's not a be all end all. I don't want to see, like, for myself, I only have the 30 acres that I can use. So I have it just year on year on year. I'll just continue to do year on year. But if I was doing cash crop, or if I had pasture, I truly would use it as a form of a rotation. Like, I want to take an old hay stand out, like our fall forage side of it. If I wanted to take an old hay stand out, I'd take that first cut off of it, probably spray it out. I'd go right into it with fall forage. Let that instantly, it's gonna start breaking that hay down. I'm not gonna have to disc, I'm not gonna have to till. Like, I'm gonna be able to use plants to do a lot of that work and that expense for me. And just using it as a tool and having plant diversity of rejuvenating that land, because if you only put up dry hay, let's say, and you only want hay and pasture land, but you've got a piece that you have to do something with. We all know going grass to grass is really difficult. You wanna always put an annual into that first. So a monocrop annual, you're gonna have to put a bunch of herbicides and fungicides and stuff like that, so it's gonna set you further back. Whereas if we can put a diverse polycrop annual in, where we can get some net soil benefits from it, when we go back into the next year on a perennial side, we can just see that net benefit year on year. So come back to the 5 principles. Any questions? I know this is kind of like drinking water out of a fire hose. It's a lot of information, but yeah.
On the grazing end of it with the warm seasons,
Mhm.
like with sorghum, what's the percentage of sorghum in the mix where you guys start to worry about like prussic acid and things like
Oh, I'm
that?
so happy you brought up prussic acid. So prussic acid has been one of the biggest pains in the polycrop industry. Prussic acid is very prevalent in grain sorghum. So true non-hybrid sorghum grass. Where we like, and not just us, but all our competitors and most forage providers sell a sorghum sedan hybrid grass. Prussic acid doesn't hit nearly as hard. So we always say, for just safety and ease, let it freeze. Like, it doesn't matter how much you have in it, let it freeze for a week before you kick cows out. Like, after a hard freeze, keep them off for a week.
Okay.
But none of us actually do. Like, I've never had an issue with a cow with prussic acid in my herd, any of the company herds, like any of the other of my colleagues have. We're all farmers. The biggest thing, and the reason why it gets confused, is just that. Same with hairy vetch. We get lots about hairy vetch, and we love hairy vetch in all of our blends. Hairy vetch seed can create toxicity in cattle. Like, if you were to feed a 5-gallon pail of hairy vetch seed to a cow, you're probably not going to come out super happy.
Yeah.
But the plant itself doesn't carry that same toxicity. So it gets confused a lot, but it's more in grain sorghum where prussic acid is a concern. And I come back to, as well, the diversity side of it makes things easier, because they're not taking one mouthful of sorghum sedan. They're taking a mouthful of that, and they're taking other things. A straight sorghum sedan field, I might want to wait a week, but even then, I know guys that have done it, they have had issues. Joe, actually, he talks in his presentation, yeah.
Sorry, I don't know what prussic acid does. Is it similar to like nitrate poisoning? Is that what it is?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, it'll kill cows,
Okay.
for sure, like, fairly quickly.
Like associated with the frost?
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
thank you.
no problem. Yeah, it's, like Joe talks about he had 6 cull cows in the pasture, and he had a beautiful warm season cross right behind or crop right behind his house. And he said, well, if anybody's cows are gonna die, it's gonna be mine. So he waited, the day it froze, he kicked them out. And he's like, I wanna see what happens here, and his cows are alive, so. We haven't ever lost a cow, knock on wood, for us.
Also, I have one more
Yeah.
question. I see in some of you've got radishes in the spring mixes.
Yeah.
Are they bolting on you, or is the amount of shade it's getting from everything else stopping them from bolting, or?
So they will go to seed if left too long, but they're a forage radish, so they're designed also to be longer. Everything we've built with our blends is we try to get as long maturity as possible. So typically you're gonna take that first harvest, whether or not it be grazing or stale, like putting it up as stored forage, you're gonna take that before it reaches maturity, typically. Like, I know on ours, like whenever they do the neighbors, none of it is, like, the very odd one you could see was starting to flower when we were harvesting.
Are they growing tubers?
What's that
Are
there?
they grown tubers?
Oh, yeah, like we got pictures on the quad rack of turnips like this and radish and daikon radishes that were a foot long, yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, no, and the nice thing, we get asked about those lots too, is in terms of what the point of them is, other than tillage. And the nice thing about it is, each of those tubers, especially if they're left in the ground, sit there and basically, they scavenge a ton of nitrogen from the soil. So they're sitting there as little nitrogen tanks all over your soil. And the following year, they break down very, very quickly. So they turn to mush as soon as it starts warming up. And all that nitrogen gets released into that soil profile, right where the tuber is, so, yeah, they work really good. So now, we're here to talk about drought and managing our operations in droughts. I wanna talk about how polycrops and microbiology, really can affect drought. But I don't wanna just talk about them, I wanna talk about all the principles of soil health, because really it takes all of it to really benefit us and to work on management. I'll show you kind of a case study as well, but I know I brought it up earlier, but like, what do natural areas look like in a drought? That's what I always go back to with any of this stuff. It's changing the way we see things. I know as a kid, I used to drive around and you'd see that Gulf green pasture that was just smooth and uniform and mowed down to this, and cows looked happy, they were all out grazing. I used to think that was just a beautiful sight. And I'll be honest, a freshly tilled field still kind of looks a little pretty to me. There's just something about it, even though I know it's not. But it's got an allure visually, but it's changing the way you see things, and I look at it now as we go out to nature in a drought situation. Like I was talking about, our ditches, our forested areas, we're still experiencing drought. And we're still experiencing vegetative growth in those situations, even if we've had very little rain, because Mother Nature has put in place things to prevent that and to be resilient through those droughts naturally. And we need to think about that on our farms and our operations. So this is an example, and this video's it's on Facebook and YouTube, and it's on our website. These are the same spots in the field. This is what I think $9,000 or $7,000 an acre land looks like. It's in the Red River Valley, Manitoba. Super high natural organic matter. You put enough synthetic fertilizers into this, regardless, you're gonna get a bumper crop every year. But you can see the striations and the layering in the soil is there, and very little pore space within that soil. And we need soil with pore space. We have to be able to infiltrate air, we have to be able to infiltrate water, we have to be able to have a home for our soil microbes. This is the same spot in the field a year after full season. And you can see the soil structure has just changed so dramatically from just planting, from just plants themselves. And I really want to point out, it's kind of hard to see, but all these little balls and the little blocks, and if you look at it in pictures, it kind of looks like black Swiss cheese. Those are soil aggregates. And those are formed through microbiology and through the root exudates and glomalin, and they form these little teeny tiny balls and structures within the soil that don't fit together perfectly and create pore space and create air space, where water can infiltrate, air can infiltrate, nutrients can infiltrate. And if anyone in the room is a conventional farmer buying conventional inputs, think about the amount of money you're spending. Where do you want that to go? You want it to get to the root structures. You want it to get throughout the soil profile so that the plants can access it. But if you're putting a granular nitrogen fertilizer into that, it's not moving around a whole lot. It gets water, it might leach a little bit, but it's not going anywhere really important. You put nitrogen fertilizer into something like this and it starts dissolving and going into your soil, it's gonna penetrate and it's gonna go through just that much easier. And I always look at it kind of like a little bit like a sponge. You take an old kitchen sponge that's been sitting there completely dried out, even though it's got some pore space, it doesn't have any life to it for sure. You put it under the tap, it takes a second or two before it really starts to absorb. That water keeps running off, right? So we want to keep that moisture in our soils at all times, because then we can absorb more. And the thing is, these soil aggregates, which are so critical to our soil health, there's not a herbicide, there's not a fungicide, there's not a dollar you can spend to build those through mechanical or inputs. We can't till soil aggregates into place, we can't broadcast them. We have to let our microbiology do the work for us. And this is the key. This is a really good picture, and I wish it didn't show up yesterday, but I'm glad I got it working today. This is an example of what building soil looks like. So they say an inch of topsoil takes 100 years or 1,000 years to build. Some guys have said less, some guys have said more, depending on where you look at. I know Steve has his own, he can build 10 inches of soil in 100 years, it sounds a bit, but this is an example of how soil is actually built. This lighter piece right here is subsoil. That's in a worm, it's in formulation of worm casting in the top 4 inches of topsoil. And it's spaced out. Well, how do we get subsoil into the topsoil? We need life. We can't till that up. We need individual life in the worms, and the worms are actually transferring subsoil up into the topsoil, and it's becoming mixed together, and that's what's forming our soil. This is how nature builds soils, and it's through the biology in their soils. In 1 teaspoon of dirt, or 1 teaspoon of soil, say, there's more living organisms than there are people on Earth. And we have to foster that. I used to think to myself, oh, I'm a beef farmer, that's how I make my money, is I farm beef. Then I've read into a couple books, and I thought, well, no, actually I'm a grass farmer, I need to grow grass, or then I convert to beef. No, I got a really big herd, but they're just really, really small. We have to foster the microbiology in our soils. That's what's going to make everything else work. So, talking microbiology and the living root and how important it is. So this is an example of our forage soybean. So you can see the nodules here, which these are inoculated with the rhizobium or Brady rhizobium bacteria. They form those nodulations, which convert atmospheric nitrogen into soil available, plant available nitrogen. These are huge nodules. And because this plant is long season and grows into the fall, it's feeding that soil nitrogen well into the fall. On these trials on gypsum, soybeans, and corn, we're seeing 50 pounds of residual nitrogen left over after a corn harvest because our soybeans are feeding so much into the soil. Now we compare that to this video, to this one here. This is a grain soybean. So we talked earlier about when plants go to maturity, they stop. Well, it's hard to see, but this is nodulated too, and this has fed some nitrogen back into the soil. But that matured back in the end of July and stopped. And so those nodules have dried up. They're no longer producing nitrogen. That plant effectively isn't feeding those soils that microbiology anymore. And so the soils that are in this field here, and you can see it's gone to seed, it's got a good soybean there. The soils there are only consuming microbiology or soil organic matter. So I come back to this here. 2021 was a dry year, obviously. We see, I went through it before, we can see the difference in the rainfall. But why is it if we experience roughly the same amount of rainfall in the growing season, why is it that I was able to get more of a harvest off of it? And remember I said this is talking about nature and Mother Nature setting herself up and putting systems in place in order to build these things. I'm of a firm belief, and with zero actual knowledge about it, 2022 is the reason why 2023 did so well. I was able to create a structure of soil aggregates that first year growing full season, where when we got this excessive amount of rain, my crop couldn't deal with it and couldn't utilize it properly, but my soil held it in suspension for when it needed it later on. And we see that lots. So this is Joe's field. This is an oat field here, planted on full season cover stubble. They got 3.5 inches. He was out in his field overnight, and he was out in his field by about 9 o'clock in the next morning. And you can see there's absolutely no puddles in the field. He's not leaving mud on it. He's not got mud on his boots, and that's a 3.5 inch rainfall. So it's a good rain, and it all went into his soil. You think about it in our world, if we get a rain at, let's say, 10 o'clock in the morning, that flash cloud comes across, drops an inch on our farm. And then it's gone, and it's in the middle of July, and the sun starts beating out. How long do you think? It just gets instantly hot, instantly humid. And that's all of that ground moisture starting to evaporate past us. So it doesn't matter if we get 6 inches in that time, or if we get 3 inches. If the sun comes out for the next 4 days, we're losing a lot of that moisture up into the atmosphere through evaporation. So like the sponge example, we want to absorb that as fast as we possibly can. This is if you go out and build or buy any soil test tool, 6-inch auger from the bush, go cut it off, take the tube off of it, put a couple handles on it, That's the best soil test tool for soil health that you can find. Pastures are great. I know, I think you mentioned your custom grazing. Pastures are really interesting to do it on too, especially where you've done some intensive grazing because you see it. This is a water infiltrator. So we're gonna measure the amount of time it takes for our land to actually penetrate and hold water to actually penetrate and actually hold. So on conventional soils that have been conventionally tilled, we're looking at about 55 minutes for the first inch on wheat or canola stuff. Which makes a lot of sense to me. Sitting at the dinner table, rain starts, finish dinner, it's been an hour, you go outside, you're probably not gonna have puddles, but the rain is just that inch, right? Makes sense if the soil is able to hold that within that hour. Second inch though is gonna take 12 to 16 hours to infiltrate. And that's when we start seeing puddles on the field, and we start seeing runoff into ditches and we start losing that moisture. With our full season, we average first inch is approximately 5 minutes to infiltrate. It's taking that whole inch in a minute, in 5 minutes, and the second inch in 33 minutes. So how we use this is we go out to the field, we pick a spot, we bury it down, we take a water bottle, full water bottle, dump it in and set your timer. Nice thing about this is when you're on bad soils, when you set the timer and you want to wait, it gives you a lot of time to think about what's gone wrong. Because you just stare at that, it's like, it should be going down, but it's not. It'll take an hour and you sit there and you'll question a lot of your decisions on how your management practices are. But then you go to a spot where it's been good and you've done good things and you've grazed it and maybe you've prevented some of your tillage and you've had multi-species, it's gonna disappear really quick and you're gonna know that soil's there. And the interesting part is in some of these soils, I did it 2 years ago on a neighbor's. When I counted it in 4 inches and the water soaked in, when I picked my ring up, it had a plug in it. The bottom of the plug was still dry. So it had soaked in that top 2 inches of soil and it hadn't actually made it down to where my roots were gonna be to begin with. So it really was doing absolutely no good. A good, 35 kilometer wind and 30-degree day on a July, that top 2 inches is dried right out anyways. I just lost all that rain.
So what is that ring then?
What's that, sorry? Yeah.
So what is the ring?
This picture is literally an old auger, a 6-inch auger. It's just a plighting. It's just a 6-inch tube. You can use anything. I have, in the oil field days, we used to use 6-inch plumbing quite a bit. So I have a 6-inch king nipple. I use in the back of my truck. Just something you can get into the ground a couple inches, but any 6-inch ring, just the way the math works out is 500 mils and 6 inches, and then just time it. So you can use anything. But yeah, it's a really interesting thing, and that's why it always comes back. It's less about the amount of water we get, but rather how well we capture it when we do get it. So a bit of a case study, right? This one's really interesting, and this is obviously it's a bit of a proof of concept for some, but this is the Los Alamos Ranch in Mexico. They're 30,000 or 25,000 or 35,000 acre ranch where they've started implementing regenerative agriculture practices in about 2006. So they're about 18 years in now. They're in the one of the big deserts in Mexico, and what they've been able to do is transform this is the neighbor to that through regenerative agricultural practices. So multi-species planting, really intensive mob grazing, making sure they're maintaining living roots. They're able to increase, obviously, the stocking density, so they're able to do more with their land. They're able to feed more cows. They're able to make more money. They're able to produce more forages in general. And actually, because it's such a big and it's pretty much a one block ranch. The National Weather Service in Mexico has done studies where the ranch itself receives like 20% more annual rainfall than the surrounding areas in the heart of the ranch. They've created their own mini microclimate through plant diversity and through growing plants. And there's microbes and stuff, and actually Steve's the one that put it onto my kind of blank on the name, but there's a species of microbiology that's in our soils that can actually convert itself, soil air and soil hydrogen, and convert it into water in the soil and make rain essentially in the soil, make moisture in the soil without actually it even raining by just fostering that microbiology. So I know we've covered a lot, but like this to me is a bit of it's an eye opener in terms of what we can do, and we're in these drought situations. And the reason for it is we're in monocrop and we're in tillage, and driving up here, coming out of, the Edmonton area where we had some rain, coming up here the other day, noticing all the black fields that had been tilled already or had been tilled in the fall. And we've got a decent amount of rain, there's standing water everywhere, every low spot's cooled and every furrow
The
is
soil
full.
structure is not there anymore, right?
We have no soil structure. We have no way to absorb that water.
Yeah.
And in a day like today, when it's a little breezy and the sun's come out, that's all gonna be gone, and then they're gonna wonder why they didn't have this. But yet you look at some of the rangeland and some of the natural pastures and the ditches, and there's no water. The ditches are designed for runoff in these, and we're yet very few times, except in their major rainfall events, do we see ditches really full of water. For the most part, they absorb it and they hold it, and it allows them to grow, so. So some topics just to take away for your own research. I mentioned it a bit, mycorrhizal fungi. It's incredible what it can do. There's been a lot of research into how plants communicate using the hyphae network. I got a video there on my phone. If anybody wants it, my card's out on the table. Feel free to grab it and ask me any questions. I can send it to you. But this researcher took four different tree species. She covered 3 of them, so they couldn't photosynthesize and couldn't uptake carbon. And she injected a traceable carbon into the one tree, and within 72 hours, the traceable carbon was present in each of the other 3 trees. Because those plants, regardless of species, it's really true, there is a network under there, they are communicating, they are moving. If this plant has too much phosphorus and this plant needs phosphorus, they're moving that stuff around the soil, whether we think they are or not, it is happening. Carbon to nitrogen ratio, balancing that carbon to nitrogen ratio is so key for proper breakdown and proper fungus and bacterial loads. I didn't mention it in the fertilizer section, but one thing we do suggest with fertilizer is if you're going into a high carbon situation like an old hayfield or pasture where we've got a really thick root layer, adding straight nitrogen to that, either through broadcast or seed row, less so much about fertilizing the plant, but more just balancing the carbon to nitrogen ratio. You'll see a huge increase in breakdown of that root layer that's in the soil. It helps speed that up rather than using a conventional tillage tool, which breaks everything up. C3, C4 plants are cool season and warm season, and then this one I'll just touch on quickly, the uptake of minerals into livestock feed. So we get asked all the time about how these polycrops are, the feed tests and the quality of them, and the answer I always say is they differ year to year. Every field's gonna be different. You've got 16 species, you get one drier year, one hotter year, one wetter year, different species are gonna come up. But we generally see fairly decent feed tests, about 13.5% protein, 69 to 70 TDN I think my size this year went about 145 or 150 RFQ for feed quality, so good feed. But the interesting part is when you're diving into those minerals with all these different plant species, and you're accessing all these different minerals, we've seen a value add where mineral consumption with a lot of our herds has gone down considerably because the mineral is actually present in the feed. So I actually had a producer that was quite concerned this year, and he was very rigid fellow. He's only ever done it one way, and he knew exactly how many mineral tubs for the size of his herd where they were going to consume in January. And he knew exactly how many they'd consume in February. So he went out and bought what he needed, went out in February, and looked around at his tubs, and his tubs were 3/4 full.
Yeah, because they got the nutrients from the feed.
Exactly. Called his vet out, his vet was coming out and to do his herd health, and he asked, he's like, I got a problem. Like they're not consuming nutrients, they're not consuming the mineral that I just spent really big dollars on.
They're getting it from this multi.
Because they're getting it from the feed, right? And it doesn't show up on a feed test very clearly. Like I compared my hay field to my multi-species this year feed test. They look very similar, but we have one grass-fed producer that's feeding exclusively polycrops, not just ours, but other blends and manufacturers. And they're convinced they're actually working with the lab to measure even the proteins and the different amino acids. So it's not just protein, but it's levels of amino acids and soluble nutrients and insoluble nutrients, and just trying to get a really good understanding of what this is doing. And Lakeland College is doing some swath grazing research this year as well on steer. It's a 5-year project to find out nutrient density of polycrops versus monocrop. So there's a definite value there of just feeding, basically, you know, I call it TMR in a bale, like, we've got our grain, we've got our energy, we've got our protein, I don't have to feed grain, I don't have to do anything else, I can just put it all as one, so. Definitely some interesting stuff that's happening.
Transferring into the product that we run, that beef is healthier for people.
Oh, and that's a whole other 2 hour talk on nutrient density food and
Yeah.
what we're consuming as a population, for sure.
I seen a stat and it was like in the nineties that I heard about that and what we have to consume versus what our great grandparents had to consume in the late 1800s. We have to consume 3 times the amount of food to get the same amount of nutrients.
I heard the same stat, yeah. And it's just not there.
But also, you gotta remember one thing, you use fertilizer, I found this out the hard way, you use lots of fertilizer, and you don't keep feeding that ground, so you drought thing.
Mhm.
When you slowly cut it back, as we have in our farm, I hadn't used fertilizer now for 2 years, and I built up, the soil structure is unbelievable, we've got earthworms now back in their soil, never had them before.
Yeah.
And the crops are doing just as good, if not better, with no fertilizer,
Mhm.
so.
And we're seeing a difference in the wildlife.
Yeah.
Especially like birds and butterflies and bees and like the insect activity and stuff like that. Good insects, not the bad, good ones.
I was talking to, Jana with, Cows and Fish yesterday, and she was talking that, they had a piece of land that when they went out, they first took it over, they had 5 species of wildlife and animals that they could count. And they just went out here recently and they're farming regeneratively and there are like 75 or 80 different species that they were able to count on a 2 hour long walk. It's kind of the old adage, build it and they will come, and it's true, like.
Just like we used to have bees, everybody the bees, everybody like bees, and I got bees in my area again. When they put the bees out on a, I think it was on a Monday or Tuesday, when we went over to another quarter, those bees are over there, they were pollinating the alfalfa fields.
Mhm.
And all the other multicultural stuff.
Yeah. Well, you guys have a great slide for the bees that I like. And it's got a little teeny tiny strip in the middle, and I have bees too, I started with beekeeping a few years ago, and there's a little teeny tiny strip on the canola flowers. And everything else is where, like, it's a very tiny part of the year where those bees collect that nectar. And I have to feed them because we don't have anything growing in our area at this time of the year, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, no, it's just everything. I'm biased because I work for the company and this is what we do as a business, but I truly believe like we can solve a large portion of our problems through management of our livestock, management of our land, and then polycrops, and plants can do a lot more than we think they can.
Mhm.
And the guys that always say, well, I can't plant a cover crop because I'm limited on moisture, so it's gonna take,
No,
it's gonna benefit you maybe 1 year because your land is a drug addict and it's gonna have trouble that first year. But you make that change and slowly implement those practices and it's gonna come along.
Yeah, did you say too, Keegan, like you could do a small acre
Yeah.
field to start with and just see how it goes and then.
We had a producer,
Throw it out.
we had a producer call me, you know, before some of our sales deadlines, and he's like, yeah, I think it was 2,000 acres, and he's like, I'm thinking about doing 1,000 acres. I was like, I would love to sell you 1,000 acres worth of seed, but I truly don't want you to do 1,000 acres. And we kind of compromised, I think, 300 acres, because he wants to do more, but I was like, your land is gonna get shocked, like, it's not, you wanna step into this in a responsible way, because the one thing with cover cropping, especially producers, and I love this room, because this room, you guys all seem very engaged within the premise of it, but I come up against, you know, competing attitudes about it sometimes with conventional farmers, and, you know, it takes 1 year of it being less than ideal, and it's a crop, it's plants, there's gonna be years where it doesn't work as good as we hoped it would. But it takes 1 year with something like this where guys are like, no, it just doesn't work. So I'd rather guys tiptoe into it and not have an economic or a lower economic risk to their operation and really see the benefit on a small scale, something they can focus on, they can put some energy towards paying attention to, than have it blasted across the whole operation and then realizing it's harder or they don't quite understand it and mistakes happen. Like this is my 3rd year planting cover crops myself. And I'm still, as far as I'm concerned, making improvements as to my own operation on how I'm doing things. Like I hope it keeps getting, well, I know it's gonna keep getting better because my soil keeps getting better, but even just my own practices, like that first year, I know I seeded too deep and I lost a lot of varieties. Last year, I thought my drill was in better shape than it was, so I know I lost a lot of varieties, like things like that I'm even learning as we go on, and if I did just done the economics of that very first year, even at 74 bales, by the time I factored in spraying and custom disking and all the costs and the bale wrapping and everything like that, it didn't financially really pay that first year, but I saw what was gonna happen kind of year on year, so. But one way to make it pay though is some of the funding that is available, so cover crops, both are perennial, and not just our stuff, but anything you out on the market right now, does apply for a lot of funding. So depending on the program you go through, there's Resilient Agricultural Landscapes Program, or Drought. They do a lot of fencing, perennials, as well as cover crops. There's RDAR, results driven agriculture. There's ALICE. There's a few different ones that work. I don't think the ALICE stuff in this area will cover any of it, but I know down south we have some ALICE communities that have developed growing roots projects and stuff like that. But they'll fund this because of the amount of carbon and reduction in inputs that this system and this process is gonna do. So I know producers that are basically getting 85% of all of their seed paid for every year that they've applied over the last 2 years. So they're basically putting this stuff in for essentially free. And then there's other programs and benefits too for, marginal acres, saline spots, stuff like that, so. So yeah, we've got some information on our website there. Couple resources I really wanted. John Kemp, he's an Amish producer from down in the States, grew up as a vegetable producer, realized that the amount of money they were spending and the nutrient density of their food was declining. He's got basically his kind of tagline is he's looking at ways to turn food into medicine again, make it sort of really building us up as humans and as creatures. So he's got a really good podcast where he talks about regenerative ag. Gabe Brown's Dirt to Soil, it's available on Audible and Apple iBooks. You can listen to it, read it. I would highly recommend it. It's basically just his story and what he saw. He went out no-till in '93. He's been synthetic free since 2006. He does absolutely no fertilizers, no tillage at all. He's got a booming operation that breaks yield records every year in his growing area. And then really our website, it's a shameless plug, but we put a lot of effort into the website and we get a lot of discussion about it. We've built it as an educational resource. The biggest thing and the reason why we do these talks when we come out is less about selling the product and more about selling the concept. You can choose to buy from us, you can choose to mix it yourself, you can choose to go to the neighbor. I just want you to take away from this that the plant diversity and what we can do with soil health is really critical to it all. And if you want to learn about, we've got our plant diversity guide there, all the different species. We've got videos, podcasts. We had Gabe Brown on our webinars here recently. I think we've got 4 seasons of 8 episodes a season covering topics from winter watering strategies to bale grazing, swath grazing, polycropping, anything you can think of. If you have a question or want us to do a webinar on it, let us know, send us an email and we can help you out. And then a dealer network all across Alberta and British Columbia as well. And support farmers across 4 prairie provinces, as well as a couple have tried it in Ontario. And we have lots of interest in the States. We haven't moved down there yet, but we're going to be on probably close to 200,000 acres this year across Western Canada growing polycrops. So the movement is growing, and especially the funding and everything that's available is making it a lot easier for producers. So I really appreciate you guys having me out and taking the time to listen to my long-winded